Goldie's Barbecue is the #1 barbecue joint in Texas for many reasons. One of which is definitely their brisket, which is beefy, smoky, tender, and incredibly rich. Well, I spent a week at Goldie's, and I actually helped out with the briskets. So I'll show you all the tricks on how you can make a legit Goldie style brisket in your own backyard, and it's super simple.
So most backyard barbecue enthusiasts do not want to invest in the quality of brisket that Goldie's uses at their restaurant. So today I am just using a brisket that I picked up at my grocery store to show you that no matter what you're working with, you can absolutely make an awesome Goldie style brisket. But if you have the coin, you can absolutely get a better quality brisket like from Porter Road or Creekstone Farms or Snake River Farms, and the list goes on. But whatever brisket you use, remember size does matter. So do not get a overly sized brisket, because if the brisket's too big, the internal fat is gonna have a lot of trouble rendering. And if you get a brisket that's too small, then by the time the crust sets, the brisket's gonna be super dried out. So try to get a brisket that's between 12 and around 16 pounds. And I would say to try and aim towards the heavier part of that range, so closer to like 15 pounds. Now the first thing, and in my opinion, the most important part of this entire brisket cooking process is the trim. Because like Max from Texarkana Barbecue says, the way you trim your brisket at the start is gonna determine how your brisket comes out at the end. But no worries, because we're gonna go step by step, starting with flipping this brisket onto the fat side. Okay, so now we're on the fat cap, and this is where most of the work is going to be done. Now we have basically two parts of the brisket. We have the brisket flat, we have the brisket point, and the first move we're gonna do occurs on the brisket point. So if I turn this around, you can see there's kind of like two mounds of meat and fat right here. We wanna focus on this mound, okay? And an easy way to tell which mound I'm talking about is to just flip the brisket over. You'll see there's always this big white hunk of fat on the lean side of the brisket, and the hump of meat and fat is on the opposite side of this fat on the lean side. So, right here. So this piece is called the mohawk, and all we're gonna do is cut it off completely. And the reason why we cut it off is that we want the brisket, after we're done trimming it, to be completely nice, smooth, and round. We don't want any parts sticking out, because with the Goldie's method, the brisket stays in the heat for a very long time, and we do not want any parts that are sticking out to burn. So now that the mohawk is taken care of, if you turn the brisket, you can see right under the mohawk there is a ton of fat that we need to get out. So the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna flatten out the brisket, and then what we wanna create is a straight line that goes down from the point all the way down to the flat. And you wanna make sure that you flatten out the brisket before you make this cut, because we want it to be straight as possible. So as you can see, this is the mohawk and this is the fat under it. So I'm just gonna cut right where the mohawk ends and the fat begins. Now that that side is cut, it's much easier to get to this fat right here. So I'm just gonna keep making angled slices, kind of cutting into the mohawk and just cleaning that up to make this top part round instead of being square like it currently is. All right, pleased with that side. So let's go ahead and focus on this side of the point. So if we look at the point, we have this big giant lump right here. And basically what this is just pure fat. And it's about as thick as the height difference between the brisket at this point to the top of this fat. So we basically want to cut this down to even it up and get it down to about 1/4 of an inch. And as I'm trimming the point, I'm going to be trimming it going down the sides of the brisket instead of going long ways, because the fat's thickness is different as you go down the long way. It's a lot more consistent if you go this way so you don't scalp your brisket. You can also poke holes in the brisket, kind of open it up to see how far the fat layer is. That way you can kind of, in a sense, see through the brisket and trim to the fat level you like. All right, both sides of the point is looking great. Now we gotta focus on the flat. So a lot of the attention of this part of the trim is gonna go towards the side that we just carved down. So not the mohawk side. That side of the fat is pretty much exactly where we want it, but there is a ton of fat on this side of the flat. So realistically, let me show you. Let me flatten this out again, but I'm gonna cut this whole chunk off, and you're gonna see this whole thing is just pure fat. See? So basically we're trying to cut off enough fat so that we can see where the lean starts, and then we can start sculpting once again to getting it down to 1/4 of an inch. See? Ton of fat, so we got a lot of work on this side. All right, and then the last thing we want to do on our brisket is to just round out the edges right here. Again, we don't want any parts sticking out inside of the cooker, and also we can use this as an opportunity to get rid of some of this thinner meat right here. All right, fat side's looking good, and that is seriously the hardest part, probably, of this entire cook. So let's go ahead and flip it over and get the lean side. And all we're gonna do right here is just to cut off this decal. And before we call this trim finished, make sure to take all of the trimming, and you want to separate the meat from the fat, because we're gonna take all of this fat and we're gonna render it down for beef tallow later on in the cooking process. So I hope that you were able to follow along and your brisket looks something like this. And with the brisket trimmed, we are ready for the next step, the seasoning. And to season, I am using this Goldie's brisket rub. So you can get this rub online or at Walmart if you're in Texas. And the special thing about this rub is it uses the actual secret ingredient in-house rub that Goldie's uses at their restaurant. So do you need this to make an authentic at-home Goldie's brisket? Well, you kind of do. And again, you can support Goldie's by buying this online at their website, and I'll have a link to that website in the description box. But if you don't have the Goldie's rub or you can't afford it, you can substitute it by mixing 1 part a coarse salt with 1 part a coarse pepper and a half part of your favorite rub. So this could be Lawry's or any of the Meat Church rubs, whatever you like to use. But remember, we're making a Goldie's brisket here, so not using the Goldie's rub, you're kind of hamstringing yourself. So when we're adding the seasoning, we want to do a nice even coat on the brisket. So I would recommend starting really high up and just kind of flicking your wrist to add the seasoning. And the hardest part of the Goldie's method is officially over. Seriously, this is probably going to be the easiest brisket cook you will ever do. You'll probably never change back to the old way you were cooking brisket. But before you take a sigh of relief, there is one thing that you absolutely need to ensure that you do not ruin your brisket. And that is a fast and accurate thermometer like the Typhur InstaProbe, sponsor of today's video. So Typhur sent me this InstaProbe about 3 months ago, and I've been really using it and testing it, and I gotta say, I love this thing. The InstaProbe is the fastest thermometer on the market with a response time of 0.75 seconds and is incredibly accurate to within a half of a degree. Just look how fast the InstaProbe gets a reading from this cup of ice water. Seriously impressive. And the Typhur InstaProbe has a super sleek design, unlike other probes which have tiny ridges and crevices that are a nightmare to clean. And because the Typhur InstaProbe has an IP67 waterproof rating, after every cook I can just put this right under the faucet, clean it, and it's as good as new. And my favorite feature of the Typhur InstaProbe is the OLED screen, which, because it's backlit, is easy to read in the day or the night. And what's really cool is the numbers are displayed in a nice, bold, easy to read font, instead of the typical digital analog clock numbers other thermometers have. So check out the Typhur InstaProbe with a link in my description box so you can get one for yourself. Thank you, Typhur.
So Goldie's cooks their briskets in massive 1,000-gallon offset smokers. And because these smokers are so massive and use convection, they cook super low and super slow. So the briskets turn out nice, juicy, and tender, and the edges of the briskets do not burn. Now, the problem that we face is that most backyard smokers, in comparison to a 1,000-gallon offset, has basically no convection. So instead of cooking low and slow, it cooks hot and fast. And what happens is the brisket experiences the curl.
In simple terms, as the brisket cooks, it's going to lose moisture and shrink. But if it's cooked with harsh heat, like most backyard cookers use, the tip of the flat right here will curl up. And as the cook goes on, it's going to get dried out, crispy, and a bit burnt. But no worries, because I'm gonna show you how best to prevent it.
So today I'm using my Camp Chef Woodwind Pro, which is super easy to use because it's a pellet smoker. You just push a few buttons and it maintains temperature as long as you want. But this pellet smoker produces insane results because of its smoke box feature that uses real wood chunks in tandem with the wood pellets. And no matter what cooker you're using, even if it's your kitchen oven, I recommend cooking between 190 degrees Fahrenheit and 210 degrees Fahrenheit, at least for the first part of the cook. Except if you're cooking with an offset smoker. If you are, then cook at around 225 degrees Fahrenheit for the first part. So for my Camp Chef Woodwind Pro, I'm cooking it at 210 degrees Fahrenheit because first of all, I'm cooking it on the top rack to keep the brisket as far away from the heat source as possible. And on top of that, I have that tray of fat under it, which is also blocking that radiant heat. And just maintain the temperature in whatever cooker you're using until the brisket reaches an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. By cooking the brisket slowly up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, we'll be able to greatly reduce the amount of curl the brisket experiences normally when you cook it in a backyard cooker. Okay, so we are at about 3.5 hours into the cook, and the brisket is looking pretty good. So we are nowhere near the 160 mark. We're probably closer to like 130, 140, but just for giggles, let's go ahead and see what it's temping at. Okay, 143, so we are getting close. So if I had to guess, we're about 2 hours away from hitting that 160 mark. But loving the color so far on this Woodwind Pro brisket. And again, it's just having those wood chunks in tandem with the pellets. It really does make a difference with the brisket. And as you can see on the flat, I am getting a bit of the curl, but honestly, it's not that much. I'm not too concerned about it. The curl would have been a lot worse if I would have cooked this at like 275 right out of the gate. But if you experience the curl and it's worse than what I just showed you right now, then something that you can do to fix it is use one of these. This is a squirt bottle and mine is filled with soy sauce, but you can use anything, apple juice or even water. Basically just spritz the part of the brisket that's starting to curl up, and as it cooks, it's going to evaporate and effectively cool down the brisket in that area. But do not spritz the brisket until the bark is set, which I'll show you in a couple of hours when we get to the next stage of the cook. And 6 hours later, this is what the brisket is looking like. So let's go ahead and temp it to see if we're in that target range. Okay, 156 right there, 156, 157, yeah, it's close enough. And as you can see, the brisket is losing a lot of its moisture. It's kind of pulling on the top of it. And this stage is called the stall because that moisture is going to basically evaporate and cool down the brisket, which works against the brisket cooking, and it kind of stays at the same temperature. So if we stay at 210 degrees Fahrenheit, well, this brisket is basically never gonna finish cooking, and we're gonna dry it out before it finishes. So at this point, we're going to increase the temperature of the smoker to 260 degrees Fahrenheit, and then cook the brisket at that temperature until it's done. And we're gonna cook the brisket until it shows the signs of when it's done. The first sign being is that the crust is set. It should be a nice dark, almost black color, and the fat on top should be completely rendered. We want our finger to be able to go right through the fat and for it to be nice and sticky. Next is the doneness. And to check the doneness, we can use the Typhor Instaprobe to poke around the brisket to see if it feels like sticking it in a jar of peanut butter. If it does, then it's ready. When done, the internal temperature should be around 190 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And this should all happen in about 8 to 9 hours. And guys, all of this information is public knowledge. I'm just compiling it all into one place. Jerby Barbecue, one of the owners of Goldie's Barbecue, recently shared most of this information in his last brisket video on his channel. Mad Scientist Barbecue has also posted stuff on the Goldie's method as well. Also, I added in a little bit of Harry Sue with that peanut butter trick. So make sure to subscribe to all of those channels, and I'll have them linked in the description box. With the brisket done, just take a big piece of foil and put a cup of beef tallow that was melting down while we cooked the brisket directly onto the foil. Then put the brisket on top of the tallow, lean side down, and wrap up the brisket. Let the wrapped brisket rest on the counter for about an hour or two until the internal temperature drops to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Then place it in your kitchen oven set to 155 degrees Fahrenheit. So don't freak out here if your oven doesn't go down to 170 degrees Fahrenheit because most kitchen ovens don't, including mine. So I'm gonna show you a trick to get your oven to cook at even lower than 170 degrees Fahrenheit if you wanted to. So every kitchen oven is different, so you're gonna have to check your model online, but for my model, all I have to do is hold the bake button until it beeps and then push down until it reads -35. So now whenever I use my oven, it will cook 35 degrees less than what it's actually reading. Meaning if I set my oven to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, it's actually cooking at 155. So I'll put my brisket in the oven to rest from anywhere between 6 to 12 hours, and then we'll see how it turned out.
Overall, I am pleased with how this brisket turned out. Definitely could have been a little bit more aggressive on the trim and took off a little bit more fat off of the fat cap, but the fat's rendered, the meat is still juicy and tender, and I just cannot wait to take a bite of this. And this is more of just a me thing, but whenever I do a brisket, I always want to look at the flat end cap because theoretically this should be the driest part of the brisket, but as you guys can see, ain't nothing dry about that. So it passes the look test, so let's go ahead and do a taste test. So the question is, how close is this to a Goldie's brisket? The smoke flavor is there, the fat render is there. I mean, even on the parts that I thought had too much fat, it's just completely rendered through and through, and it has this nice, like, rich sweetness to it. The only, like, super glaring difference I can taste is just in the beef flavor of the brisket. The Goldie's brisket is just such a nice deep beef flavor, and I'm just not getting it with this grocery store brisket. But I definitely think that's more to do with the fact that I got this brisket from a grocery store instead of getting a higher quality brisket. If I could redo this cook again, I probably would have gotten one from Porter Road or something. But that's not saying that this is bad at all. Like, seriously, after I turn off the camera, I'm gonna eat a lot more of this brisket. So if you can only get lower quality briskets, do not let that deter you from trying out this recipe. Make sure to watch the next video on your screen where I experienced Goldie's firsthand by working there, waiting in line, and trying the #1 barbecue in Texas. And I'll see you guys over there.